everyone, Pam Gregory Astrologer. This is going to be a very different kind of video from my usual video because I will be referring to some very important astrology in a little while, but it's actually what we're going to be sharing with you, my very good friend Sandy Humby and I, is a past life adventure in southwest France. And my good friend Sandy Humby is an absolute genius at shifting stuck energy from the land, from houses. I know no one better. She is an absolute magician, and you will get a very good sense of how she works in us sharing this story with you, because it was really 4 days of a magic carpet ride. So let me explain the background to this, how this all began. 17 years ago, I left my marriage, and it really was time to start making real the dreams. My mother had passed a few months previously and she'd left me a small inheritance. And I'd always wanted to buy a small house in rural France. And so I set that very clear intention. And within about a month, I saw an advertisement for a house. It was buying off plan, so the site was still a field. And so I called the number. It was an area of France I didn't know at all, down in the southwest. And the sales lady said, well, you'll have to be quick because there's one house left off plan. So if you want it, you're going to have to go down very soon. So I was on a plane the next day down to southwest France and went to the site. Sales agent in France picked me up, and it was just a field. And I was absolutely mesmerized by the site. I could not stop looking at the mountains. I was just hypnotized by them. And I remember saying to the sales agent, well, this feels like home. I have to have it. He must have thought, boy, is this woman a pushover. This is the easiest sale I have ever had. So that's how I started to buy the house in France. It was very rural and it was very beautiful. And the whole idea was it was on the edge of a very old 10th century village. There was a beautiful little river on the side of the village. And the whole idea was this development potential was on this site that I was at that point standing in. And it was going to be little cobbled streets, coloured shutters, terracotta roofs, very much in sympathy with the very old village over the river. And everything went magnificently for about 2 years. I absolutely adored it because the whole idea was that they would, for a small service charge, they would mend things that broke, you know, they'd cover all the maintenance. There was a massive sort of Olympic-sized swimming pool there surrounded by olive trees. And one of my absolute joys was going down at dawn when there was no one there and just swimming on my own up and down and just watching the sun come up over the mountains. Now, as I said, I was just mesmerized by the mountains. So for 2 years, it was idyllic. And then the developer went bankrupt. You know, you can probably anticipate what was going to happen there. So, and everything started to unravel. All of the residents got together and started various legal cases. Every one of the legal cases failed. The service charges for the site were going up, and it was impossible to rent because the site was really, you know, tumbleweed was starting to blow through. It was really deteriorating. So that went on for 7 years. The difficulties went on for 7 years, and money, legal money, service charge money was fire hosing out. But because I owned the freehold, I just couldn't see how to get out of the loop. Estate agents wouldn't look at the site. They knew about the problems. And actually there'd been further problems because for a quarter of the houses, there was a big flood. They flooded. And mine was one of the ones that flooded. And the massive mirror came off the wall into 1,000 pieces, all the furniture rotted, and it stayed like that for 2 years. And the management people wouldn't communicate. And I flew down, they still wouldn't communicate. They were ducking and weaving because they knew all the residents were suing them. So it was a very intractable situation. And in case you're wondering how on earth did an astrologer get herself into this almighty mess, I have to say that the astrology was incredibly positive at the time I was buying. It was very interesting that it was a nodal return. And my last book was all about the nodal axis. It was a nodal return, which means at the soul level, this is a very positive step for you to take for your soul's growth. So I knew that. The previous nodal return, 19 years before, I got married. Now, 19 years after, I'd left my marriage, and not only was it a nodal return, so the right thing for my soul's growth, but I also had transiting Uranus on my sun in the 4th house of the home, ruling the 9th house of foreign places. I mean, it was so clear. Jupiter was coming onto my sun, so both transiting Jupiter, transiting Uranus, new perspectives, big new horizons, freedom, think big. And it felt so exciting. And I took possession of the house on my mother's birthday, who'd left me the inheritance. So there were so many positive signs. But for 7 years, as I say, it was horrendous, and it was incredibly stressful. And there'd been a couple of hints from other friends. One friend who's very psychic had said, you were the leader of a big group, and that is one of the keys to solve your problem. But I had no idea what that meant. The other friend was my good astrology buddy, Bracker Goldsmith, who I've only ever met twice. And the first time was when I said, look, you love France, come down and spend a week with me. So picked her up from Narbonne station, drove to the site, got out of the car, and I said, we're going to have a glorious week, not a cloud in the sky. And she said, all I can see are piles of dead bodies. Terrific. And for the week, Bracker followed me about an inch behind me. You know, I went to the dustbins, Bracker followed me, she went everywhere. She was pretty freaked by these piles of bodies that I couldn't see, but she could. So that was another hint of perhaps what was to come. Anyway, I was really stumped. And at this point, I was doing a local talk. Sandy Humby, who I knew a little bit, but not well, very kindly volunteered to come and do the bookstore for me. And afterwards, as a thank you, I said, you must come to supper. And told Sandy all of this horror about what had unfolded. And I think at that point, Sandy, you said,
I'll come. If you want somebody to come and resolve that, I'll come.
My heart leapt because I hadn't realized Sandy did this kind of work. I was very aware of her beautiful rose alchemy work. She's incredibly gifted at that. But I didn't know about the energy transformation, the energy alchemy that she did. So I think it was within 2 weeks. We went down. But before we went down, you asked about the location because you wanted to look at a local map.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I like to do is to have a bit of a tune in, you know, before I land somewhere, whether it's in this country or, you know, anywhere really. I like to get a sense of the lay of the land, so to speak. And it was just fascinating when I looked at where the development was. And I'm familiar with the sort of Carcassonne area of the south of France, but not this particular area. And I looked on the mapping, and the place that just radiated for me was a place called Termes, which I'd never heard of before, but it turned out was a Cathar chateau, or in ruin now, of course. And I turned around to Pam and I said, well, you know, on our trip down, we really must go to Termes as well. Termes has got something to do with the story.
And you called me and said, Termes, this ruin, you know, at the top of a mountain is lit up like a beacon. And I said, well, that's really funny because that's my favorite place in the entire world. And every time I go down, I just climb up, you know, to the top of the mountain to go to Termes. I take friends there. I just adore it. And I said, that's really funny you mentioned that. So off we went late November into deep, bleak France at that point, because it's just, if you've ever been to rural France, this was very rural, it's just dead. So the site, the development site wasn't open for us to stay there. So we stayed in a local village, and it was very hard to find accommodation, but we booked into this very old, it was hundreds of years old, wasn't it, Sandy? I think 10th, 11th century apartment, but the energy was as thick as treacle, wasn't it? So that was your first job when we landed there.
You know, and we didn't get there till about 9 o'clock at night, driving through these narrow lanes. You know, not really know it. Well, I certainly didn't know where we were going. And getting to the place late, and then knowing that actually we were going to I was going to need to space clear. I was going to need to create a sanctuary for us for the time that we were there. So one of the tools I have in my tool bag is to work with the seed point of the building and create a sanctuary space for the time, for the length of time that we were going to be there. So that was my first job in the process.
The ground running, because and the energy by the next morning was totally different. Absolutely. So Sandy did a masterful job, and it was just brilliant. It just lifted by the next morning. And I think you felt that the first day, we were there for 2 clear days, as it were, traveling on day 1 and day 4. And you felt that we had to go to the development first, didn't you?
Absolutely. I absolutely knew that held a key for us. That was going to be the first piece of the unlocking, and that the visit to Tem had to come after that.
And so we were staying in the adjacent village. So we drove to the old village that was right on the edge of the development and parked there. And it's beautiful. You walk down over a river before you climb up to the development. And we stopped it because the river was one of the reasons I bought the house in the first place. It was just magical. But you stopped there for 2 reasons, I think. Firstly, because of the light and the orbs, you took photographs.
Yeah, it was magical.
Secondly, you said to me, are you aware that there are about 60 people walking behind you? They're not walking behind us, they're walking behind you. Women, children. Do you remember that?
Yeah, men, women, and children. I could feel the pressure starting to build up behind me. And it's got a particular feel when you feel like you've got this sort of push going on behind you. And it was the first piece of the unfolding of this next piece of the journey.
Yeah, and the river had particular significance for you, didn't it? Which you weren't expecting.
No, Pam, it's one of those things when you step forward to do house whispering or space alchemy, there's always something that weaves both ways. There's always 2 aspects. So in showing up to be that conduit of the story, to be like a Poirot, really, in unraveling the story, there's always something that is connected to my story. So there has to be a piece to my story that connects to your story. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been working together.
Yeah, amazing.
So for me, there was an absolute memory of my time working with Mary Magdalene in the south of France, many centuries prior to the piece of work that we were going to uncover together. So it was the start of the magical adventure as we went over that bridge to take us into the development.
Wow. So we climbed up into the development, and there are about 172 houses there. And Sandy felt we needed to walk all around the development with this crowd of beings behind us. And I was feeling the weight of the emotion. I mean, it was profound. You couldn't miss it. It was palpable. And at one point, Sandy just stopped and said, "This is where the massacre began." And I said, "Well, that's my front door." And that was the only house left on the plan. And so again, Sandy was very aware that there'd been a huge massacre. But again, we didn't have all of the pieces of the story at that point. So we walked around, and we walked down into the herb garden, because you wanted to find a piece of earth, really, where you could release these souls that were walking behind me.
Yeah, it was getting a bit intense. They didn't want to back off. I was saying, come on, guys, back off a bit. This is a bit intense. And it was very clear, because there were people working on the site, weren't there? Because actually they were pruning the roses. They were clearing the roses, which I also felt was really significant in the unraveling of the story. And because I have a very strong connection with the path of the rose, the way of the rose, there was a real sense that had a piece to show in the story. But I remember us standing overlooking where the swimming pool and the communal building was, and actually looking down and going, no, we need to go down over there. We need to go down where the herb garden was, on the edge of the stream. And So that's what we did, trying to look as unobtrusive as possible, that nobody was going to be tracking where we were heading for the, with the gardeners on the site.
And then you were able to create your own particular magic to release all of the souls. And I think you said they all came forward and bowed to me.
Yeah, they did.
Leader.
So there were steps down from the swimming pool area that took us down into that herb garden. And the guidance I had was that you and I stood on either side of this stairway down. And I, every time I do a job, I don't know what's going to unfold, and in a lot of ways, it's just being totally present to what is wanting to be revealed in the moment, which is the magic, really. I never have a program in my mind as to how something is going to unfold. So I just sensed that we were forming a gateway, and that one by one these souls came down the steps and they genuflected to you, they bowed to you, they moved through the portal that we had created and returned to spirit. And that we waited as they came through, and I could hear in the distance this sound of the Cathar hymn, Le Bouvier. And actually, if anybody wants to check that out, if you Google Le Bouvier and the Cathar hymn, it's a haunting, haunting sound that tends to repeat. Once you hear it, it rolls through. So they were coming through until we'd cleared all of the souls that were stuck on the development. And what was fascinating was that there were 5 Catholics that then came forward when everybody else had gone to ask for forgiveness. And they turned to you, and each one asked for forgiveness as they moved through. So the story started to show itself that, in fact, that you had led these women, men, women, and children, to what you had felt was a safe place, because you knew
there used to be a church.
Because it was another reason why you chose this property, was the fact that it was actually built on consecrated ground. So the developer had to get permission to actually develop this complex on this particular piece of land. So the story started to come clear as these souls had gone through of what had happened, and the fact that you had led this group to what you thought was safety, but you had been followed and you were then ambushed. And so this was part of the reason why it felt so familiar for you when you stood on that piece of land.
It really was home. And with Sandy mentioning the Song of the Cathars, which I'd never heard, we went back to our apartment where we were staying and found it online. And Sandy is so right. It's haunting, it's melancholy, it has deep pain, despair, and fierce hope in it. And it was rolling around. I just want to hear it again and again. And I still play it now because it takes me to such a deep place. It takes me right back to all of that experience and of course back to that Cathar lifetime. Yeah. So that was kind of day one, wasn't it?
Yeah. And actually we took roses back because the gardeners, there was only one exit, so we had to go back up after this process, back up and out the same way. The gardeners were stacking all of these beautiful roses that they'd cut off onto trailers, and we asked whether we could bring some back with us. So we brought some back to the apartment, and I knew that was going to be part of our process for the next day, was through the heart of the rose, the golden heart of the rose.
And it was such a deeply moving day with all these souls. I mean, I had no, conception I'd been a leader or lived, I just know. But anyway, so that was the first full day, as it were. And then the next day, we went up to Term. And Term, as we say, is just a ruin, but it's way up in the mountains. I mean, you're absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And you've got to go up a lot of switchbacks, hairpin bends, up, 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 up. And I don't think Sandy was thrilled about the drive either, because it's just a sheer drop on one side. There's absolutely no protection. So we zick, zick, zick all the way up. And then you've got to park and climb as well, walk very, very steeply up to the ruin. And heights don't bother me, but this is where the flashbacks of your past life started to kick in.
Absolutely. I've always, this lifetime, I've been terrified of heights and being on the edge of something, on the edge of the mountain, or getting near the edge anywhere, and that feeling of being pulled over. And actually what that connects back in for me is a Cathar lifetime at Montségur, and being one of the ones that went over at Montségur carrying the Cathar treasure. So this was, I still haven't got. So Pam was horrified when I was clinging to the side to try and get up this really hairy journey right up into the centre of the chateau. And yet I knew we had to go up there, because I knew there was another piece that we had to get at Term.
And it was so fun because, I was saying to Sandy, don't worry, you're safe with me. And I remember Sandy snapping back, well, it didn't work that well last time, did it? But, equally, we both knew we had to get to the top. Remember, we are absolutely in the middle of nowhere, no human soul to be seen for miles. And eventually we got to the top, didn't we? And you were very nervous about coming down. I said, look, I always come down this certain way, and it's going to be fine. It'll be easier than the clamber up. But you said, no, we've got to go back this way. And I was thinking, oh, this is going to be so steep for you. But you insisted on coming back that way. And what that meant was that we'd passed a plaque that in all the times I'd visited Term, I'd never seen before. I'd just never seen it. And we took a photograph, because what Sandy was feeling, and Sandy will say more about this, but Sandy absolutely knew, or really felt, that I was the Cathar perfecti there at the time, and this was historically known, historically recorded. There was a siege of the chateau from August to November 1210. And Sandy really felt that I was the perfecti. I was, spiritual head of the group at that time. And so one of our questions was, well, how many were there? Was there just one perfecti or several perfecti? And what the plaque said, which was so weird, which was absolutely what we wanted to know, there was only one perfecti here at the time of the siege by the Catholics in 1210. I thought, how weird it says that, because that was our question. So we took a photograph. And then you asked, Sandy, didn't you? You asked Spirit, really, if I was perfecti at that time.
Absolutely, and I got it really clear. I mean, it was an awful siege in that year, and it was a very hot summer in France, and those up in the chateau were without water. All the waters were drying up. They were in a dreadful state, really. And when the rains did come, there were dead animals and all sorts in the containers for the water, and a lot of the people that were left there died of dysentery. And what I got as a very clear sense was that Pam had made the decision in her lifetime as the perfecti, to take this group of about 70 men, women and children out and down in a secret way that she knew, that she could take them to what she thought was going to be a place of safety, which was the consecrated ground and the chapel that the development was built on. So it all began to make sense of what was going on. And we'd come down some steps on that particular side of the chateau and paused at a plateau. And I'd taken roses up with me, and you know, we'd got that level of understanding of the symbology of Tem for Pam in part of her own story unfolding. And there were another 44 souls that came forward then to acknowledge Pam and be released, which we did with the roses that we brought from the development. And lurking in the corner, in the shadows, was an energy that I researched later to understand a bit more about, was someone who called himself Simon de Montfort. And he was a very shady, shadowy figure, but he was terrified that he was going to hell, which was a really fascinating piece of the storyline to show itself. So
what was fascinating as well, when Sandy uses her dowsing rods a lot when she's doing this, and as we were standing in that little place, having seen the plaque, Sandy asked the dowsing rods, was Pam the perfecti here at the time of the siege of the Catholics in 1210? And she got instantly, yes, yes, yes. And I felt this absolute thunderbolt of energy going through me. It was just in a millisecond, boom. I said, did you feel that? And you said, yes, you've just downloaded all the keys and codes of leadership. And I think you took a photograph of me at one point. I said, no, barely keeping up with this. And so that was absolutely astonishing. And I felt at this time that I was kind of slipping between lifetimes. I didn't quite know which lifetime I was in. And what's important astrologically is that this was my inverse nodal return. So this, again, I bought the house at my nodal return with the universe saying at the soul level, this is absolutely the right thing for you to do. Then 9 years later, this is happening at the inverse nodal return, which is all about at the soul level, closure of the deep past. It's often connected to past lives. It's releasing problems from past lives that have leaked into this life and affected it. It's awakenings, it's revelations, it's understandings, but it's like the fool kind of stepping off the cliff edge, that you are now closing that past in order to move forward cleanly and productively to the future, all at the soul level. So this weave of the tapestry between the nodal return, the inverse nodal return, was astonishing. And I was so aware of the astrology at that time, because when you get these incredibly powerful nodal points, nodal return, nodal square, inverse nodal return, they're like portals. They're like portals where the deep past leaks through, and it can be quite mystical. So, you know, in all this magic, I barely, it was hard for my feet to touch the ground, because there was so much magic happened. And the other thing we didn't mention, Sandy, is that you set up a grid in the apartment for this whole process, didn't you? I called it your Harry Potter grid, because it had crystals and roses and just magic.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I do with most of my space clearing consultations, because it's just a beautiful way of anchoring the light. And working with fresh rose petals, working with the Rose Alchemy Oracle, and also crystals, because I'd taken certain extractor crystals with me so that I knew that I was going to be able to support the process for you and for whatever was going to come together, but also that it was going to hold the whole process with grace and with love. And for me, whenever there is spirit release, and this was multiple spirit release involved, then it's always done with that real sense of heart presence and honor for the trauma that you know that a soul might experience.
It was so remarkable. And Sandy had explained, you know, the history had stopped at people starting to become ill with dysentery. And what's really odd is when I was 26 and I used to do a lot of trekking in the Himalayas, I contracted a very, very rare form of amoebic dysentery that they couldn't fix at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. And in fact, it turned into other chronic diseases, which plagued me for about 39 years. And that was only resolved exactly at this time, just before and just after we were doing this trip. So that was another completion of the dysentery, which of course linked to the, in my world, linked to the dysentery that the people had experienced. So as a perfecti, Sandy said, I then led these people over hill and dale, probably for 3 or 4 days, to get to the church. It would have been a long journey on foot, thinking we were safe. But then the Catholics followed us, as you said, and that's when the massacre happened. The massacre, the bodies that Braca could see, and obviously all that Sandy could see. And divine intelligence had waited 800 years for me to buy, I'm so goosebumpy, for me to buy that house very deliberately, last house on the site, off plan. I didn't have the gift to release the trapped souls in the land, but Sandy did. And it was through Sandy's gift that all of that could be unlocked, all of that could be released. And there were 172 houses on the site. And as I said, estate agents just wouldn't get involved. They wouldn't look at it because there were so many problems. But then by chance, an opportunity came up to sell, and I sold the property within 4 months. And the release of that, I was the only one to sell in the whole site, and I think everyone else is still very enmeshed in it. But the fact I was the only one, because Sandy had released the energy, and we closed the door on that lifetime. And not only did that relieve massive financial pressure and stress, but also it gave so much meaning to the experience and the previous 7 years of challenge. It gave such meaning to it. It enriched my life massively. It's one of the most extraordinary adventures I've ever had in my life, but it couldn't have happened without Sandy to release all of that and to do it with such love. And it's enriched, as I say, it's enriched my life enormously, not only to understand what all that story was about, which nobody else could do for me, but Sandy actually put names and dates. I felt my name at that time was Gautier. I haven't got the second name yet, but that's my, and I have such a strong sense of it. I couldn't have tapped into any of that without Sandy's gift of being able to see that. And what she does in her energy alchemy is she is able to identify the trauma, the date, the name, so often the actual event of how the person or the people have got trapped in that particular space. I don't know anybody who has that level of gift and genius.
And just to say, I'm not clairvoyant at this point anyway. I'm not clairvoyant, I'm clairaudient and clairsentient. So it comes in as an absolute knowing, an instinctive knowing, and then I will often hear words, and I have the ability to tune my radio dial down to actually connect with earthbound spirits, so that I can hear the story. I hear what the trauma was, what the heart trauma was that meant that they didn't leave and return to spirit cleanly, that a fragment of the soul, the incarnated soul, gets caught in the seat of the trauma, where the trauma happened. And it doesn't, and sometimes, there will be trauma where the soul goes on to something else, but actually at the time of passing with unresolved trauma, they will go back to where the incident happened.
It's just such an amazing experience. So not only did Sandy solve the problem and create closure in all of that, including closure in the past life and closure for all of those trapped spirits, with the 44 at term and the 70 at the development, they were all sent to the light. So that was an immense service for the collective. It was an immense service to the earth. But I can now view that in such a positive light, so much meaning embedded in that whole experience, rather than, you're not going to believe what happened to me and how, all of that. It turned everything into positivity. And I'm so grateful for that experience. But what is extraordinary also is how the astrology was weaving so perfectly, so literally, into Sandy's magic down in southwest France. It was extraordinary. And I think, Sandy, you have some photos on your website of that whole trip.
I do, actually. I've got two websites. One is rosealchemy.com, which is mostly my work with the roses and the rose of the heart, the way of the rose, the way of sacred homecoming to self. And my other website is sandyhumby.com. And that's mostly about my work as energy alchemy in spaces as a house whisperer. So there's lots of stories. One of the stories on the website, on Sandy Humby website, is the story of Pam's, my journey with Pam. And there's a whole series of photographs that you might like to see, because they will give you the sense of the magic that unfolded in our journey. And yeah, I think Pam's going to put the links in underneath the video, and also that I have a couple of videos that are in my shop that might be of interest to you, because they explain a little bit more about what makes up the note of a house and how we can manage and create sanctuary places for the soul. So
beautiful. I mean, beautifully said. And I don't know anyone who has such a gift to that degree that can get all of the detail in the way Sandy does. And I couldn't be more grateful to her. She saved my bacon. And I felt it was so much meant to be. I couldn't do that on my own. I don't have that gift, but Sandy does. And just bless you, Sandy, for being a wonderful human being and pouring love into the world with your work.
Thank you, Pam. I mean, it was just such an adventure. It was it was enriching, and an enriching journey for both of us in the process. And we had a lot of fun in the journey, as well as the
hilarious moments. Yeah, hilarious. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I know Sandy has done this kind of work for other people. It's very fine. It's very precious work, and I just want to give her a huge cyber hug and thank her a million for being there when she was so needed. So bless you, Sandy.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, everyone, and I hope you found it interesting. Very different video, but I just really felt that I wanted to share Sandy's work with you all, because she may be able to help somebody out there, maybe one of you. So thanks ever so much. Back to my regular updates next week. Bye for now.